That afternoon, walking home from school, Samuel's mind was only occupied by the weight of a math problem he couldn't solve. That problem for him was the biggest issue of the day, his greatest concern. But he didn't yet know that this was no ordinary Friday afternoon, that his life would irreversibly change on that short walk home. The air had cooled slightly, and the orange and purple colors of the setting sun painted the sky like an artist's palette. As usual, he was walking along the edge of the park, watching the shadows bouncing off the sidewalk stones. The weight of his backpack stung his shoulders slightly, but this was a familiar feeling for him. The noise of the street mixed with the joyful, distant sounds of children playing. Everything was normal. Everything was ordinary. Until that moment. A woman with a baby stroller coming toward him caught his attention. The woman, with her other hand, held the leash of a black, medium-sized dog. The dog was restlessly jumping and bounding next to its owner, seeming to have directed all its attention towards Samuel. Samuel was a boy who loved animals, so this situation didn't frighten him at first. However, the dog's behavior was beyond ordinary curiosity. The animal's ears were pricked up, its nostrils flared, and a deep, threatening growl came from its throat. This sound was a strange and unsettling note that seeped into the beautiful evening landscape. The expression on the woman's face was filled with a tense anxiety. She frequently bent over the stroller to check if the baby was asleep, all the while trying to restrain her dog. As Samuel noticed the distance between them shrinking, he instinctively slowed down a little. The dog's growl intensified. The woman was trying to control both the stroller and the child at the same time, and this gave her the look of a desperate tightrope walker on the verge of losing her balance. With a tense, cracking voice, she said to the dog, "Don't do it. Please don't do it." These words felt as if they were directed not just at the Tom, but in some way at Samuel too. This caused the subconscious alarm bells to ring inside Samuel. But at that moment, it didn't even occur to him to turn back and take another path. He simply wanted to get past this tension and continue on his way. As Samuel passed the woman, everything happened at once, and it was so fast that it took him a few seconds to fully comprehend what had occurred. For a moment, the dog was standing in front of the woman. The next moment, it strained against the leash, went around and behind her, and lunged at Samuel's legs. The first thing Samuel felt was not a sharp pain, but shock. As he tried to understand what was happening, the pain spread through all his nerve endings. The dog's teeth went through the fabric of his pants, savagely gripping his flesh. Samuel stumbled and stopped for a moment, but the dog immediately retreated after the bite. On the leg of his pants, a damp, dark stain had now appeared. He was in shock. His heart was beating fast, and he heard a ringing in his ears. The brisk and the woman were still a few steps behind him. The woman was holding the dog tightly, looking at him with horror. She didn't offer Samuel an apology or ask him a question. Her eyes were just filled with a fear he couldn't name. Samuel didn't say a single word to her either. He just looked. Then, as if nothing had happened, he started walking quickly. There was a strange burning sensation on his face and an unbearable ache in his leg. At that moment, he just wanted to get home, to a safe haven. He wanted to get away from that woman and that dog as soon as possible. Without even looking back, he hurried on his way. When he arrived home, he knocked on the door and heard his mother's voice say, "I'm coming." When he stepped inside, he felt a dread mixed with the peace that comes from being home after a long day. The pain in his leg distracted him from everything else. As he walked into the room, his mother, holding a spatula, asked, "How was school?" Samuel mumbled, "It was good, Mom," trying to hide his leg. But his mother immediately noticed the strangeness on Samuel's pale face. "Is something wrong, Samuel?" she asked, approaching him with concern. She saw the blood stain on Samuel's leg. She let out a scream. Panic filled the entire house. His father came running from the kitchen. Samuel told them what had happened. The words were choked in his throat, but he told them. The hospital visit became one of the most frightening memories of Samuel's life. The glaring brightness of the lights, the smell of antiseptic, and the nurse's quiet, hurried movements made him even more nervous. When the doctor examined the wound, his face became serious. "A deep bite," he said, turning to his father. "What's his vaccination status?" His father said that all of Samuel's vaccinations were up to date. The doctor was relieved, but still said, Because of the risk of rabies, we need to know if the dog was vaccinated. If we can't find the dog, unfortunately, we'll have to give Samuel a rabies vaccine. These words filled Samuel with an icy fear. He was given 4 shots. The pain of the needles felt as if it was meant to suppress the pain of the bite on his leg. The shots he received in his arms and leg were some of the most intense pains he had ever felt. He had been told that those shots were nothing compared to the ones he would have to take if the dog wasn't found. This thought had turned into a nightmare in Samuel's mind. His mother and father mobilized to find the dog and its owner. When they returned from the hospital, they immediately went to the police station. The police took the incident seriously and started an investigation, but they had no name, no address, and no definitive information about the dog's breed. Samuel's description of a black, medium-sized dog could have applied to hundreds of dogs. This situation slowly consumed Samuel's and his family's hope. They prayed every day for the point to be found. Every night when Samuel went to bed, he saw the dog's growl and the woman's anxious face. The pain in his leg reinforced these images that constantly came to life in his mind. Days passed. The wound on Samuel's leg was slowly healing, but the fear and trauma inside him were still fresh. On his way home from school, every shadow reminded him of that dog. Every time he heard a dog bark, he flinched. A week had passed since the incident, and there was still no news. His family tried to comfort him, but Samuel lived under the shadow of the possibility of getting more shots at any moment. That day, he had understood how a simple walk could turn his world upside down, how life could turn into a tragedy with one simple incident. That event was no longer just a memory in his mind, but an existential threat that could return at any moment. One evening at dinner, his mother said, "Samuel, your father and I talked," her voice trembling. "If we don't find that dog tomorrow, we'll have to go to the hospital and get you a shot." Samuel's eyebrows furrowed and his heart started pounding in his chest. "But Mom, maybe the dog will be found," he said with a weak hope. His father put his hand on his shoulder. "I know, son, but this is necessary for your health." That night, Samuel couldn't get a wink of sleep. In the dark, staring at the ceiling, he was crushed under the heavy burden placed on the shoulders of a 7-year-old boy. That day, he had been bitten not only on his leg, but also on his innocence. The next morning, the sun rose as it always did, but for Samuel, this felt more like an end than a new beginning. They were silent at the breakfast table. His father said, "Let's go. We'll try our luck one more time," as if trying to console himself. They left the house and went to the edge of that park. Samuel was looking around in fear. They were desperately looking for the woman, that terrifying moment. But to no avail. The path on the edge of the park was as crowded as ever. Children were playing happily, bicycles were whizzing by, and people were walking their dogs. But neither the dog that had attacked Samuel nor the frightened woman was anywhere to be seen. Samuel saw the disappointment and anxiety on his mother's and father's faces. They had given up hope too. At that moment, Samuel whispered, "Mom, Dad, I'm okay. Let's go to the hospital." These words were proof of the growing fear and courage inside him. He wanted this torment to end as soon as possible. Enduring the pain of the terrible shots was better than enduring the pain of this uncertainty, this fear. The dog that bit him and its owner had disappeared into the unknown, and Samuel, to escape their shadows, was ready to accept the pain in his own body. This was a huge decision for a child. They were also surprised and proud of Samuel's courage. They went to the hospital. This time Samuel was more prepared. He rolled up his sleeve, grimacing as he faced the pain. 4 more shots, then 4 more shots. This nightmare would end with a total of 14 shots. The incident left a healing wound on Samuel's body, but in his mind, it had opened a wound that would live with him for the rest of his life. After that day, everything was different. Samuel no longer walked through the park. When he heard any dog bark, his heart started racing. The sunset reminded him of that terrible moment. That day was the most concrete evidence in a child's life of how innocence is lost, of how cruel and unpredictable the world can be. The silence in the Nunez household was a heavy, suffocating thing. It had settled in the living room and crept down the hallway, a tangible presence more oppressive than any physical threat. December 9th dawned cold and gray, a mirror to the mood that had overtaken them all. The frantic search of the previous day, the desperate, hope-filled walk along the same sidewalk, had yielded nothing but disappointment. Samuel, a week after the incident, was now living in a state of quiet terror. He was not the same energetic, carefree boy. The sight of a dog on television, the distant bark from a neighbor's yard, even the sound of a phone ringing would make him flinch. The fear of another series of painful injections hung over him like a dark cloud, and his parents, Maria and Mr. Nunez, were at a loss for how to soothe him. Their own emotions were a tumultuous mix of anger at the unknown woman, guilt for not having been there to prevent it, and a profound, gnawing frustration with the injustice of it all. Mr. Nunez, a man of methodical habits and quiet resolve, felt a deep sense of failure. He had always prided himself on being a provider and a protector, a solid rock for his family. Yet, in this instance, he had been powerless. He had walked that path countless times, a futile expedition to find a woman he couldn't describe and a dog whose breed he didn't know. The police report, filed with the Pflugerville Police Department, felt thin and inadequate, a mere piece of paper that couldn't capture the trauma his son was enduring. He had spent the morning on the phone again, calling the police station, the animal shelter, even local veterinary offices, his voice a tight, strained whisper of hope in a sea of dead ends. Each "I'm sorry, sir, we have nothing," was another brick on the wall of his despair. He was in the kitchen, staring into a mug of lukewarm coffee, when the phone rang. It wasn't the kind of ring that announced a friend or a family member. It was the sharp, insistent jangle of a landline, a sound that in this digital age always suggested a matter of importance. Mr. Nunez's heart leaped into his throat. He hesitated for a moment, an almost superstitious fear gripping him, as if answering would somehow seal a fate he didn't want to confront. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for yet another round of polite rejections, and picked up the receiver. Pflugerville Police Department, Officer Miller speaking, a crisp, professional voice said on the other end. Mr. Nunez's hand tightened around the phone. Yes, this is Mr. Nunez. I'm calling about the incident with my son, Samuel. Yes, Mr. Nunez, the officer's tone shifted, becoming more direct and less formal. I'm glad you called. We were just about to contact you. We have some news. The world seemed to stop. Mr. Nunez's mind raced, a flurry of possibilities and what-ifs. He braced himself for the worst, for the news that the dog was gone, that the owner couldn't be found, and that Samuel would indeed need those shots. We located the man, monsieur, Officer Miller continued, his words slow and deliberate. There was another incident this morning, involving another individual. It was the same dog with the same owner. A wave of relief, so profound it was almost dizzying, washed over Mr. Nunez. He sank into a kitchen chair, the tension that had been a constant companion for days finally beginning to drain from his body. You found them, he whispered, a mix of disbelief and gratitude in his voice. Thank you. Thank you so much. But the relief quickly curdled into a cold, hard anger. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was negligence. This woman, who he now knew to be Ms. Rodriguez, had allowed her aggressive dog to bite another person. This wasn't just about Samuel anymore. This was about public safety. The officer explained the details, and with each new piece of information, Mr. Nunez's resolve hardened. The second bite had occurred in a different neighborhood, but the dog's description, the owner's frantic actions, they were all a chilling echo of Samuel's experience. This was no coincidence. Mr. Nunez carefully wrote down Ms. Rodriguez's name and address, the details of the second victim, and the new police report number. As he hung up the phone, he felt a strange sense of purpose he hadn't had since the incident. This wasn't about a random act of misfortune anymore. It was about holding someone accountable. He had a name, a face for the woman in the park, and a path forward. He went to Samuel's room where his son was silently assembling a puzzle. They found the dog, Samuel, he said softly, a gentle smile on his face. You're going to be okay. No more shots. Samuel looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes that had been absent for a long time. From that moment on, Mr. Nunez was transformed from a worried father into a meticulous investigator and a determined advocate for his son. He started by gathering every document he could find. He had the initial police report from December 8th, documenting Samuel's testimony and the lack of a known suspect. Now he had the new report from December 9th, detailing the second incident and, most importantly, the name of the dog's owner. He requested a copy of the police file, which included statements from the second victim and the responding officers. He also gathered all of Samuel's medical records from the hospital, detailing the deepness of the wound, the 4 initial shots, and the explicit warning from the doctor about the need for further shots if the dog were not found. He created a small, neat folder, organizing everything chronologically. This wasn't just a collection of papers. It was a testament to his son's suffering and a weapon in his fight for justice. He also found the doctor's statement, a critical piece of evidence. The doctor, in his official capacity, had stated that a full series of rabies shots would have been necessary in the absence of a confirmed, vaccinated dog. This statement not only highlighted the severity of the threat, but also quantified the potential trauma and medical intervention that was narrowly avoided. Mr. Nunez read through the police report for the second incident with a cold, analytical eye. The victim, a young woman, had a similar story to Samuel's. The dog had been jumping around, the owner had been frantic, and the bite was sudden and unprovoked. It sickened him to think that this could have happened to another child, another family. It reinforced his conviction that he was doing the right thing. The process of compiling these documents was a way for Mr. Nunez to regain control. For days he had felt helpless, a passenger in a car veering out of control. Now he was in the driver's seat, meticulously charting a course toward justice. He made copies of everything, creating a duplicate file for his records and a primary file to be used in court. He researched local statutes and ordinances regarding dog bites and owner liability. He spoke with a lawyer who specialized in personal injury cases, laying out the timeline and presenting the evidence in his carefully constructed folder. The lawyer was impressed, noting that Mr. Nunez's diligent work had already built a strong foundation for the case. The transition from concerned father to legal plaintiff was a difficult one, fraught with emotional complexity. Mr. Nunez wasn't motivated by greed or a desire for revenge. He was motivated by the desire for accountability. He wanted Ms. Rodriguez to understand the full weight of her negligence, to see the consequences of her actions, not just as a financial burden, but as the emotional and physical scar she had left on his son. He wanted to ensure that this would never happen to anyone else. The folder of documents, once just a collection of facts, had become a symbol of this resolve. It contained not just a child's pain, but a father's love, a community's concern, and a system's ability to correct a wrong. It was a folder of hope, meticulously assembled and ready to be presented to the court. The hum of the air conditioning unit in the courtroom was a constant, low-frequency drone, a steady undercurrent to the unfolding drama. Ms. Rodriguez, sitting in the witness stand, felt the weight of every gaze in the room. The sterile environment, the polished wood, the stern faces, all of it felt alien and accusatory. She gripped the edge of the chair, her knuckles white, as she began to recount the events of December 8th. Her voice, at first a shaky whisper, gained a fragile confidence as she navigated her own version of the truth, a truth that felt entirely different from the one Mr. Nunez had so methodically presented. "It was a regular Thursday," she began, looking at the judge, not the opposing counsel. "Around 2 p.m., I was taking my baby for a walk. My sister is afraid of dogs, so I'm always very careful to keep my dog Bandit on a tight leash." She paused, taking a sip of water from a small plastic cup. Her dog, a lively mix of shepherd and something smaller, was usually a sweetheart. A little jumpy, perhaps, but never aggressive. The events of that day, she insisted, had been a strange and unfortunate misunderstanding, one she now, with the benefit of hindsight and a lawsuit hanging over her head, deeply regretted. She had been so focused on her baby's sleep schedule and her sister's anxieties that the boy had barely registered as a blip on her radar. "I saw the boy coming down the sidewalk," she continued, her voice firmer. "He was a small boy with a backpack. I moved to the left side as far over as I could, so he would have plenty of room to pass." She gestured with her hands, as if recreating the scene in the air. I had the stroller in my right hand and my dog on my left. I just stood there waiting for him to go by. The phrase "just stood there" was her repeated refrain, a phrase she believed conveyed her non-threatening passive stance. She wanted the court to understand that she had taken every reasonable precaution. She had positioned herself to the side, away from the boy, making it explicitly clear that he could pass without issue. In her mind, she had done everything right. She wasn't an aggressor. She was a bystander who had simply been trying to get through her day. She testified that as Samuel walked past her, her dog had indeed reacted. He started barking, she admitted, her face flushing slightly. It was a quick, sharp bark, like he was surprised. I think he was just reacting to the boy's sudden movement. She claimed that she had immediately turned around and pulled the dog back. I pulled on his leash and said, "No." It was over in a second. She looked at her hands, which were now fidgeting nervously in her lap. The lawyer for the Nunez family had a different story, a different timeline, a different set of facts. She was trying to fit her version into the legal framework of what happened, but her memories were not so clinical. They were a jumble of her baby's contented breathing, the weight of the stroller, the tug of the leash, and a split-second interaction that had, for her, seemed completely innocuous. The boy didn't react, she stated with a finality that felt defensive. He just kept walking. He didn't say anything, he didn't stumble, he didn't look back. She recalled the boy's posture, his determined stride, the way he just kept going. "I didn't assume anything," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I thought maybe the dog had startled him, but he didn't seem hurt or scared. So I just carried on with my walk." Her mind filled in the blanks. She assumed he was fine. A dog barks, a child gets startled, and life goes on. It was a simple equation in her mind. The idea that something more had transpired, that a bite had occurred, was completely foreign to her. She hadn't felt the dog lunge or snap. She hadn't seen a wound. She hadn't heard a cry. From her perspective, nothing had happened. This testimony painted a picture of a woman completely unaware of the gravity of the situation. Her account, while seemingly rational from her point of view, was also laced with a chilling denial. She was a mother trying to manage a stroller and a dog, and in that moment, her focus had been on the more immediate threat, her dog's perceived misbehavior and a small boy's passing. The idea that she had been negligent, that she had been anything but careful, was a hard pill to swallow. She wasn't a bad person, she told herself. She was just a busy person, a multitasking mother doing her best. But the court wasn't interested in her intentions. It was interested in the facts. And her facts were in direct contradiction to Samuel's. She was cross-examined for hours. The lawyer for the Nunez family meticulously picked apart her story. "You say you just stood there," he began, his voice a smooth, dangerous silk. But the boy, Samuel, testified that the dog was jumping around and making growling noises. "Which is it, Ms. Rodriguez?" She stammered, trying to reconcile the two realities. "He was jumping a little, but I had him on the leash," she said. "But he wasn't threatening." Her explanations grew weaker, her certainty dissolving under the weight of his pointed questions. "And you say the boy didn't react," he continued, "but his mother testified that when he got home, he was pale and had a wound on his leg." Ms. Rodriguez's eyes widened, a genuine shock crossing her face. I didn't know," she whispered. This was the first time she had been forced to confront the potential consequences of her actions. She had been so consumed with her own version of events that she had never considered the possibility of a bite, of an injury, of a family's nightmare. The court was a place where different narratives collided, and Ms. Rodriguez's was now on full display. Her version was one of passive observation, of a quick, manageable incident that had no lasting consequences. But the evidence told a different story. The police reports, the doctor's notes, Samuel's testimony, they all pointed to a negligent woman and an aggressive dog. Ms. Rodriguez's testimony was not just an account of an event. It was a psychological portrait of someone who had chosen to turn a blind eye, to believe what was most convenient for her fortune. She had carried on with her walk, but the boy she passed had carried on with a life-altering trauma. And now she was being forced to face the realities she had so carefully ignored. Her final statement was a quiet, almost tearful plea. "I'm sorry that a boy was hurt," she said, looking down at her hands. "But I honestly, truly didn't know. I never would have left if I thought something was wrong." But in the cold, objective world of the courtroom, good intentions were not enough. Her failure to act, to even check on the boy, was her central liability. She had been a participant in a traumatic event, but had chosen to be an observer, and that distinction would be her undoing. The judge's face remained impassive. The jury's expressions were unreadable. The weight of the court, the weight of the evidence, was slowly but surely closing in on her. The courtroom, a place where truth was meant to be distilled from testimony, had become a crucible of conflicting narratives. Ms. Rodriguez's account of a startled dog and a boy who simply walked away was now pitted against a new, more damning piece of evidence, her own sworn statement. It was a document filled with a different set of facts, a different sequence of events, and a different motive for the dog's actions. The judge, her gaze sharp and unwavering, held the document in her hand, a physical manifestation of the contradictions that were beginning to unravel the case. "Ms. Rodriguez," the judge began, her voice cutting through the stuffy silence of the courtroom, "in your sworn affidavit, which you signed and submitted to this court, you stated a different chain of events, a different story entirely." The judge's tone was not accusatory, but clinical and precise, like a surgeon preparing for a difficult operation. "You claim that the plaintiff, Samuel, came up from behind us and scared Nala. You also stated that in response, Nala reacted to protect us. Could you please explain to the court which of these two stories is the correct one?" A hush fell over the room. Ms. Rodriguez, who had just spent the better part of an hour trying to portray herself as a careful, diligent dog owner and an unwitting participant in a minor incident, now looked completely lost. The color drained from her face as she stammered, searching for words that would bridge the chasm between her two conflicting narratives. The first story had been a passive event, a simple reaction to a passing child. The second was an act of aggression, a defensive action taken by a dog named Nala, whose name was now spoken in the cold light of a courtroom. It was a sudden, jarring shift in the narrative, and the weight of it was crushing. I, I, I don't, I was just, it happened so fast," she stuttered, her previous fragile confidence completely gone. She looked at her lawyer, a silent plea for help in her eyes. But there was no help to be given. She was on her own, faced with the consequences of her own inconsistent words. The judge, a woman who had seen countless cases of deception and denial, was unmoved. She simply looked at Ms. Rodriguez, her expression a blank slate of judicial authority. The judge leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a serious, instructional tone. "Ms. Rodriguez, I will tell you something. When you have a truthful story, a real story, you don't have to have a good memory, because the truth, no matter how many times you tell it, remains the same." The words hung in the air, a devastating indictment of her testimony. She was not being accused of having a poor memory. She was being accused of lying. The implication was clear. The fact that she had two entirely different accounts of the same event was proof that neither of them, in their entirety, was likely to be the unvarnished truth. Her first story was a tale of passive reaction, of an innocent dog getting startled. Her sworn affidavit, however, was a story of aggression, of the breed reacting to protect its owners from an approaching child. The two stories were mutually exclusive, and the judge had zero tolerance for this kind of contradictory evidence. The judge continued, meticulously dissecting the details. "And you said you were concerned about your sister's fear of bugs, which is why you were being so careful. But in your sworn statement, you talk about the dog, Nala, protecting you. Which is it? Are you the protector or is the dog?" The subtle shift in her language, from a defensive position to an aggressive one, was telling. The judge's sharp-witted questions were not designed to get a confession, but to expose the contradictions that lay at the heart of Ms. Rodriguez's defense. Her carefully constructed narrative was crumbling, piece by piece, under the judge's persistent scrutiny. Ms. Rodriguez tried to explain, to rationalize, to mend the broken pieces of her story, but every word she uttered seemed to dig her deeper into the hole she had created. "He wasn't behind me," she insisted. "He was coming towards me. I don't know why I wrote that. It was a mistake. I was scared. She was now visibly shaking, the reality of her situation finally crashing down on her. She hadn't just been a distracted mother. She had been a negligent one. She had not only allowed her dog to bite a child, but she had then tried to cover it up, to create a story that absolved her of all responsibility. The judge then turned to the other critical piece of evidence, the second dog bite incident. The court also notes that you were cited for your dog, Nala, biting this child, but not for the other incident that occurred the following day. The judge's words were a heavy final blow. This revelation introduced a new layer of complexity to the case. It was no longer just about the conflicting testimonies of two people. It was about the legal consequences, or lack thereof, of two separate, yet related incidents. The judge explained that the police report for the second incident noted that the dog involved was not on a leash, a clear violation of city ordinances. This detail was crucial. While the dog may have been the same, the circumstances of the second bite were different in a way that had legal ramifications. It suggested that Ms. Rodriguez had not learned her lesson. She had continued her negligent behavior, but in a different, legally distinct way. Mr. Nunez, sitting with his wife in the gallery, watched as the judge methodically dismantled Ms. Rodriguez's defense. He felt no sense of triumph, only a quiet sadness. This was not the person he had envisioned in his anger, the cold, heartless woman who had endangered his son. This was a frightened, confused woman who had made a series of bad choices and was now facing the consequences. Her denial, her fear, and her conflicting stories were all a part of her own tragic narrative. But a child had been bitten. A child had been scarred. And no amount of sorrow or regret could change that. The court, he knew, would not be swayed by her tears or her excuses. It would only be swayed by the facts, the evidence, and the law. And in that regard, Ms. Rodriguez's case was on very shaky ground. The hearing concluded for the day, leaving the court in a state of unresolved tension. The judge's words, particularly her statement about the truth not needing a good memory, would surely be replayed in the minds of the jury for days to come. The case was no longer just about a dog bite. It was about integrity, accountability, and the stark difference between perception and reality. Ms. Rodriguez's sworn statement, her second and contradictory account of the incident, had been intended to protect her, but it had instead become the very thing that would condemn her. The truth, as the judge had so clinically pointed out, was a constant, and Ms. Rodriguez had presented two different versions of it, sealing her own fate in the process. The stage was now set for the final act, where the jury would have to decide which version of events, if any, was truly credible. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. The jury had returned, their faces impassive, a blank wall against which both the Nunez family's hope and Ms. Rodriguez's anxiety were reflected. The judge, her demeanor now solemn and resolute, began to speak, her words carrying the finality of a gavel strike. She did not waste time with pleasantries or preamble. She went directly to the heart of the matter, to the moments leading up to the incident and the conflicting testimonies that had defined the case. Ms. Rodriguez, the judge began, her voice a calm, authoritative drone that demanded attention. I believe you sensed in your dog, Nala, that your dog was uncomfortable. The judge's words were a quiet bombshell, an unexpected psychological insight that cut through the legal jargon and the conflicting facts. It was an assertion that went beyond the physical events and delved into the subtle, unspoken bond between an owner and a pet. Ms. Rodriguez's eyes widened, a look of genuine surprise on her face. This was not a legal argument. It was an observation of human and animal behavior, and it resonated with a truth she had been subconsciously denying. She had spent the entire trial focused on her actions, her testimony, and the facts of the case. But the judge was pointing to her feelings, to her intuition. The judge continued, weaving a plausible narrative of what might have truly occurred. You had this dog for 5 years, a 5-year-old dog, and you had a new baby that had been with you for a very short time. It is not uncommon for an animal to feel a sense of jealousy or displacement. This was the core of the judge's reasoning, a profound piece of insight into the potential emotional landscape of the household. It wasn't about a vicious dog or a negligent owner in the traditional sense. It was about an owner who had failed to recognize a significant emotional change in her pet, and as a result, failed to take the necessary precautions. The dog's behavior, the growling, the jumping, the aggression, they were not random acts. They were, in the judge's estimation, a direct result of a new dynamic in the home that Ms. Rodriguez had failed to manage. The judge then turned her attention to the plaintiff, to Samuel, and his actions that day. "When the young man passed you," she stated, her voice firm and clear, "he did not come back in an aggressive way. He did not come back to bother you. He did nothing wrong." This was a powerful, unequivocal statement that exonerated Samuel completely. It dismantled Miss Rodriguez's sworn affidavit, which had painted Samuel as the aggressor who had scared Nala. The judge was making it clear that Samuel was a victim, a child walking home from school, and his actions in no way justified the attack. The entire burden of responsibility therefore shifted entirely to Ms. Rodriguez. The judge's argument was a masterpiece of common sense. If you had a sense that your dog was agitated, that your dog was not comfortable in this situation, she continued, then your responsibility was to remove the dog from the situation. You should have crossed the street. You should have put the baby and the being out of harm's way. This was the central point of her judgment. It wasn't about what Miss Rodriguez had done, but what she had failed to do. She had been presented with a clear and present danger, an agitated dog and a passing child, and instead of taking the proactive, responsible action of moving away, she had instead forced the child to navigate around her and her restless pet. She had, in effect, set the stage for the incident to occur. Her decision to just stand there, a phrase she had so defensively repeated during her testimony, was not a sign of caution, it was a sign of negligence. The judge took a deep breath, and the courtroom held its collective breath. The moment of the verdict had arrived. "Therefore," she announced, her voice echoing with the weight of her decision, "I find for the plaintiff, a judgment is awarded to the plaintiff in the amount of $2,500. The number, though not a large sum in the grand scheme of legal battles, was not what mattered. What mattered was the principle. It was an official declaration that Ms. Rodriguez was at fault, that her negligence had caused a child to be bitten, and that her conflicting stories and her lack of responsibility were not to be tolerated." Mr. Nunez, sitting next to his wife, felt a wave of emotions wash over him. It wasn't triumph, not in the way he had imagined. It was a quiet sense of vindication. The tireless work, the meticulous document gathering, the long days in court, it had all been worth it. The money was secondary. The validation of his son's story, of Samuel's trauma, was what truly mattered. The judge's words had been a powerful affirmation of their struggle. Samuel was a victim, not an aggressor, and justice, in its slow and methodical way, had been served. Ms. Rodriguez, on the other hand, was left in a state of stunned disbelief. The verdict, the judge's searing indictment of her actions and her character, was a heavy burden to bear. The court was not just punishing her financially. It was also holding her accountable for a failure of empathy and responsibility. Her denial, her attempts to shift blame, and her inconsistent stories had not protected her. They had sealed her fate. She had spent the trial trying to be the victim of circumstance, but the judge had revealed her to be the cause. She had not only lost the case, she had lost her credibility. The weight of the judgment, the knowledge that she was now legally responsible for a child's injury, would be with her long after the final payment was made. The incident had changed Samuel's life, but the trial had changed hers as well. She would never again look at her dog or her baby or a passing child in the same way. The courtroom began to clear out, a murmur of conversation replacing the stifling silence. The legal battle was over, but the emotional scars remained. Samuel's physical wound had long since healed, but his emotional journey was only just beginning. The verdict was a step in the right direction, a validation of his experience. But the real healing would happen at home, in the love and support of his family, in the slow, painstaking process of learning to trust the world again. The case of the Bamal, and the stroller was now closed, but its impact would echo for years to come, a cautionary tale about responsibility, empathy, and the quiet, unseen burdens we all carry.